So hey guys, I know I was meant to be covering Homerpalooza, but I decided in the spirit of The Simpsons Season 32, I thought I'd give you a review for the premiere episode that dropped on Sunday night. Don't worry, Homerpalooza is coming next week. Of course, the premiere episode is episode 1 of Season 32, entitled Undercover Burns. It was directed by Bob Anderson and was written by David Cryan. It follows the story of Mr. Burns going undercover in a highly futuristic disguise to figure out why people at the plant dislike him. There isn't much of a B-plot either. This episode stars David Harbour as Mr. Burns' elaborate disguise, Fred Kranepool. This is also the first episode with Alex Desert playing Carl Carlson. I will comment on this recast at the end of my review. For now, let's analyse the plot of this episode and answer if it's good or bad. The episode begins with a fair at the nuclear power plant. Hey, there's Smilin' Joe and Cuda. Mr. Burns separates the kids from the parents and tries to force the children to work for him. Lisa gets away and finds Burns to call him out for breaking child labour laws. Mr. Burns then runs into the men's room. Eventually, Lisa follows him but leaves the men's room as it's too gross, and Mr. Burns sees some nasty messages of him inscribed on the stall walls. This is a nice, inciting incident. It delivers some jokes and it sets up Burns' motivation quite well. Burns decides to go undercover and Smithers brings in some experts to give him an elaborate disguise. This is our plot point 2 and shifts us into the second act. Mr. Burns, as Fred, tries to make friends, but conveniently he is called over by Homer to join him, and Lenny and Carl too. Mr. Burns spends time bonding with the three men and he soon becomes one of them. We get this nice montage of them hanging out, with decent humour mixed in. Back at his home, Mr. Burns tells Smithers he's made new friends, and he decides that his only concern now is that friendship. This is our midpoint, and it shifts us into the second half of the second act, and acts as a no-return point for Mr. Burns. Fred, or Burns, disrespects Smithers in front of the gang, and they encourage him to take on Burns himself. Mr. Burns does this elaborate thing where he talks to himself, and then talks to Fred, and then talks to himself. I hate to nitpick, but I thought this voice changer was a microchip that was being put in his mouth, or something he has to swallow. So it's a little weird why he's not removing that microchip thing. On the same case, we also see Burns' hands when he's inside the outfit, but we know that Fred's face is a mask. There is a lot of inconsistency with this disguise. It's obviously unrealistic, but I just wish they were consistent with it. It could provide more conflict for Burns actually. I feel he achieves this foolery kind of easily. Mr. Burns radically changes the plan, installing food stalls specifically for Lenny, Carl and Homer. This enrages Smithers. He drags Homer to a room and shows him evidence that Fred is Burns. This is our plot point 2 and shifts us into the third and final act. I honestly wished that Homer had figured this out for himself. I get why Smithers tells him and all, but it makes it way too easy for Homer. Homer breaks his friendship with Fred, and when Lenny and Carl begin making fun of Burns, he attacks them, but Homer steps in the way. Homer ends up ripping off Fred's arm and a chase ensues. Burns has this weird identity crisis with his disguise. He imagines Fred attacking him and fighting with him, but it turns out that the costume has just been falling on him. This is our climax. It's a little underwhelming. I wish that imaginary fight scene was a little longer honestly, as it was quite entertaining. Homer then helps Mr. Burns and gives a speech to the workers, basically saying that there should always be a horrible boss on top and workers to follow orders. I know this is played for jokes by the writers, but if Mr. Burns was a real figure in society today, then it would be pretty horrendous to work at the plant. Mr. Burns vows to revert back to normal and Smithers is more than happier, but then Mr. Burns takes off a mask and reveals that the masked lady from before was Mr. Burns the whole time. I actually hate this joke so much. The fourth wall breaking, the confusion. Stop, Simpsons, it wasn't funny, it ruins the story. We get a joke at the end with Smithers introducing Don Phonyman, which I thought was actually a pretty decent joke to finish off the episode with. Well, kind of. We also get this end credit scene with Mr. Burns doing karaoke as Fred. I don't know, both are decent tag-ons though. Overall, the plot is fairly good. It's paced quite well and it flows nicely. They don't waste much time with Homer outside of his work environment, which I'm really glad they didn't. This is a Burns story, so it doesn't make much sense to see what Marge is going up to, for example. I think the costume is a little stupidly advanced, and I don't see why they couldn't have gone down the route of cosmetic surgery, but I guess 1, you have to reverse that at the end of the episode, and 2, Burns is pretty damn fragile. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the suit. I think it's inconsistent, and I think they could have just used the suit way more as a part of the conflict. They have a few jokes with his speech malfunctioning and the mask coming off on a roller coaster, but nothing that actually affects the story itself. I think the plot for the most part is good. Nothing that blows my socks off, but I certainly don't think the plot is broken or anything. It's a little bog standard, but at least it's not all over the place and broken. On a side note, I'm not a huge fan of some of the overdramatic music that's used in the episode. It's a little stupid in places and feels really dumb. Anyway, as mentioned, there were many plot important moments that had humour sprinkled into the mix. So let's take a look at some of these jokes, shall we? The humour in this episode is good. I don't think most modern episodes have anything that is laugh out loud funny, but certainly this one wasn't painfully unfunny. My favourite joke is the big crying cucumber that Burns comments on in the bathroom stall. I think most people who have been in a men's bathroom understand and relate to this one. The joke that followed up that is my second favourite joke of the episode. Effigies can be burnt? The "why do people call me ape and not gorilla or orangutan" from Homer is a pretty decent joke. I smiled at that one at least. Some nice visual jokes in the episode, some at the start, at the fair, and some funny ones in the montage too. But the worst joke by far is that stupid mask-off reveal at the end. Burns steaming from his head, making the work whistle noise is also pretty lame. Not a fan of jokes that make absolutely no sense. The scene with Moe and Phil Rosenthal was a pretty terrible one too. What's worst about this one is it's pretty much a cutaway gag, and I just think cutaway gags are super lazy. That's probably why I should never review Family Guy. Like I said, I think the jokes are good in this episode. No point going over all of them, but I certainly think most of them are character driven and fit within the story, apart from Anyway, let's take a look at our characters in this episode and see if their depiction is good or bad. The obvious protagonist of this episode is Mr. Burns. All of the story beats are caused or at least affect him. You could argue that Homer is the protagonist too in some instances, but I feel like Homer is more of a false ally to Mr. Burns. He helps Mr. Burns at first, but near the end, Homer becomes more of an antagonist to him. Smithers is really the main antagonist of this episode, although he also is kind of the false ally archetype too. Mr. Burns gets some new development in this episode for sure. I don't think it's entirely new just because Mr. Burns has had so many damn episodes focusing around him, but certainly the friendships he gains affecting his ability as boss is somewhat new. We've seen multiple examples of this Homer/Burns friendship being displayed, but this one is kind of unique in the sense that Mr. Burns actually wants us to change his business operation 100%. It's also unique in the fact that we have this weird Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde scenario. Mr. Burns is a little conflated with his new and old personality. There is an argument that Fred is an entirely new character altogether. He is radically different to Burns in many ways, but maybe this high tech just brought out the suppressed natural kindness that Burns always had deep down in his head. Maybe. The thing that breaks him though is kind of silly because yes, it makes sense that Mr. Burns would be hurt by what Lenny and Carl say, but that was kind of his motivation at the beginning. He started this undercover plan to find out why people hate him after he read the mean things on the Stall Wars. So why is he surprised when Lenny and Carl start saying their stuff? Maybe it has something to do with Burns' ego, but I just wish they kind of developed this aspect a little more and kind of showed us why. Maybe Lenny and Carl's doubt Burns' good intentions with the plan change, and this makes Burns mad. We kind of get this a little bit with the whole "you ungrateful" line. I just wish they gave us a little bit more. We don't get much characterization with Homer really, some stuff here and there with him being enthusiastic to go to work and the family being shocked about this, but Nothing too new on his character overall. He isn't that active in the story that much, to be honest. I think he really should have learned about Mr. Burns' identity by himself and not have Smithers do it for him. I think Smithers is underdeveloped in this way. It may have been better if they made this more of a Smithers versus Burns story. We certainly have this to some degree, but we could have seen Smithers trying to fool Mr. Burns' plan a bit more maybe. Maybe actually add a scene of him capturing that footage he had. In conclusion, I think the characters in this story are dealt with pretty well. I think with how much they've done with Burns, this is a fairly good take on his character. They could have done more with Homer and Smithers, but ultimately this is a Burns story. Anyway, I think I've talked enough about this episode. Let's move on to the score. So before I start gathering my thoughts, I think we should talk about Alex Desert as Carl. I've read mixed opinions on this recast, but my thoughts are, it's okay. Not the perfect recast by any measure. I do think in some line deliveries he's pretty damn good, and in others he's not so good. The voice at times is way deeper than Carl's regular voice, but at other times I barely notice the difference. Now I think this may be an issue of waiting for Alex Desert to really hone it down. I think it's entirely possible that with time he will begin to perfect the voice. I mean, look at early Simpsons as an example. Some of the voice portrayals early on in the series were pretty funky. Honestly, Marge's voice was a little distracting in this episode. I think Julie Kavanagh's voice box needs a break. Overall, Undercover Burns is a good episode. There are certainly aspects to it that are a little weak, but I never heavily disliked the episode. I do think it's a little bog standard at times, the story felt very simple, and not much uniqueness was really injected to spice things up. The suit that Burns wears is inconsistent, and I wish they did more with Homer and Smithers, but for the most part, I enjoyed this episode on both my viewings. Anyway, I give Undercover Burns a solid 6 out of 10. Now, let's move on to the wheel. Wait, there is no wheel. Homerpalooza is next week. Don't worry, it's coming next week. I think he really should have learnt about Burns' identity by himself and not have Smithers. Who the fuck is Smithers?